My name is Chris Lawson, and I've driven all over the country in my caravan. I've encountered strange people, eerie towns, and desolate highways. But nothing prepared me for what happened one particular night. It started like any other journey. I had been driving through a deserted stretch of highway late in the evening, far from the nearest town. The road was long and straight, bordered by endless stretches of desert on both sides. I was tired, but the pull of the road kept me going. I had just finished my last cup of coffee, and was beginning to feel the weight of sleepiness settle in, when I noticed something strange. In my rearview mirror, I saw a set of headlights. A car was following me. I wasn't surprised. I'd passed a few cars earlier in the day, and it wasn't uncommon for other travelers to be on the same route. But this car didn't seem to be going anywhere. It stuck to my rear bumper, just far enough behind to stay visible in the mirror. At first I thought it was just coincidence. I sped up a little, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed. But no matter how fast I drove, the headlights stayed there, locked on my tail. I tried everything, switching lanes, slowing down, even pulling over to the side of the road, but nothing worked. The car remained there, as if haunting me. My heart began to race, and I started to feel paranoid. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The road stretched on endlessly, with no exits or rest stops in sight. The only sound in my caravan was the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle from the walls. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to pull over again, this time hoping that if I waited long enough, the car would pass. I parked on the side of the road, the headlights still shining in my mirrors. I sat there, staring into the darkness, waiting for the car to go around me. But it didn't. The headlights stayed unmoving. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out onto the empty highway. There was no sound except for the wind. I looked down the road, but the headlights were gone. No car, no lights, just the empty highway stretching into the distance. I walked to the back of my caravan, wondering if I had just imagined it. But when I turned back toward the road, I froze. The headlights were back, but this time, they were right in front of me, illuminating the entire scene. I jumped back into the caravan, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The headlights stayed there for a few moments before slowly fading out. And then, just like that, the road was quiet. The car, or whatever it was, had vanished. I stayed in that spot until sunrise, but I never saw another car that night. To this day, I don't know who or what was following me, but I'll never forget those headlights, glowing bright in my mirror, and the feeling that someone, or something, was right there with me in the darkness. My name is Emily Frost, and I have always been skeptical of the supernatural. I don't believe in ghosts, or spirits, or any of that stuff. But there was one night, alone in my caravan, that made me question everything. It was just me, parked near a quiet lake, with nothing but the sound of the water lapping at the shore. I had been driving all day and decided to stop for the night. The area was secluded, and there wasn't a soul around. I loved it peaceful.com, with nothing but the stillness of nature. As night fell, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into bed, watching the stars through the skylight. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something knocking. It was soft at first, almost like it was coming from the door. I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I sat up in bed, heart racing. I got out of the covers and walked to the door. I checked the peephole, but saw nothing outside. The moonlight barely illuminated the area around the caravan, but there was no sign of anyone. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder. Knock, knock, knock. I opened the door quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, maybe a fellow camper or a lost traveler. but the doorway was empty. The night was still and quiet, as if nothing had moved for hours. But as I stepped outside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There, on the ground, just in front of the caravan, was a set of footprints, fresh, deep impressions in the dirt. The strange thing was, they were facing my door, but there was no sign of anyone walking away. The prints just stopped at my doorstep, as if the person had vanished into thin air. A chill ran down my spine. I rushed back inside and locked the door. The knocking stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there. For hours, I lay wide awake, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But every now and then, I would hear the faintest sound, the softest of whispers. Like someone was standing just outside, waiting. By morning, the footprints had disappeared, but I could still feel the unease. I quickly packed up and left, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder as I drove away. I haven't parked near that lake since, but sometimes, when I'm alone in my caravan, I can still hear that knock, 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 knock. My name is Liam Turner, and I've been a long-time road traveler. I've camped in hundreds of different spots, but there was one place I'll never forget. A remote campsite deep in the mountains that I stumbled upon while exploring the back roads one summer. It seemed perfect, far away from everything, just me and nature. I was looking forward to some alone time, with nothing but the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. When I pulled in, I noticed something odd. A small group of campers had set up nearby 3 tents, a few campfires, and a couple of jeeps parked along the trail. They didn't seem to be in distress, but something about them felt off. I didn't think much of it at first. I pitched my tent a little further away from theirs and set up my camp. The night crept in slowly, and the air turned cooler, the sky blanketed with stars. I decided to go for a walk, just to stretch my legs. That as I walked down a narrow path that led to a stream, I heard the sound of voices up ahead. It was the campers. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but their conversation sounded distant, muffled by the trees and the sound of the water. Curious, I followed the voices until I came to a clearing, but when I stepped into it, there was no one there. No campfire, no tents, no sound, just an empty space in the woods. I was confused. How could they just disappear like that? I turned around, wondering if I had imagined it, but the path I had walked down was suddenly longer. The trees seemed to be closing in, the forest feeling more dense and unfamiliar. I started back toward my campsite, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger with every step. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was being followed. My heart began to race. When I reached my campsite, I found my tent was disturbed footprints in the dirt leading up to it. There were no other signs of anyone being there, but I could feel that something was wrong. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my stuff and was about to leave when I saw it. A figure standing near the edge of the clearing. They were motionless, their body outlined against the trees, staring at me. I couldn't make out their face, just a vague silhouette. I shouted, asking if they were one of the campers, but they didn't respond. The figure remained still, almost like they were waiting for me to make the next move. Suddenly, the forest was dead silent. No crickets, no birds, nothing. I felt my blood run cold as the figure slowly vanished into thin air, like they had never been there at all. I ran back to my caravan and locked the doors, barely able to breathe. I didn't stay another minute. I drove off in a panic, and when I passed the campsite, it was completely empty. No signs of the campers, no tents, just an untouched wilderness. I never returned to that spot, and to this day, I can't explain what happened, but sometimes, when I drive through the mountains, I see shapes out of the corner of my eye, watching me from the trees. My name is Jake Matthews, and I've always been the kind of person who loves finding treasures in unexpected places. A vintage item at a thrift store, an old book from a yard sale, it's those kinds of things that fascinate me. But there was nothing interesting about the old radio I found in the back of my Caravan. It was an old, dusty piece of equipment, its exterior scratched and faded. I had purchased it from a flea market a few weeks before, thinking it might add a bit of character to my Caravan. It was a simple, classic radio, nothing too fancy, but it worked perfectly fine when I tested it. That is, until that one night, I was parked at a remote campground, miles away from the nearest town. The place was quiet, almost eerily so, and I had decided to spend the night there, just enjoying the peace and solitude. As the darkness set in, I turned on the radio to have some background noise. The first few stations I found were normal: news, music, static. But then, something strange happened. As I was flipping through the stations, I heard something that didn't belong: voices. At first I thought it was just interference, but the voices became clearer. They weren't just static, they were actual words. And they weren't normal radio broadcasts. They sounded distorted, disturbed. I couldn't make out all the words, but the phrases were chilling. "We know you're here. You can't escape. Leave now, or you'll regret it." I froze, my fingers still gripping the tuning dial. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard the static intensify, the voices becoming more insistent. I tried to turn off the radio, but the knob wouldn't budge. It was stuck, the sound growing louder, the voices more frantic. "Get out of there!" the voice on the radio screamed. "It's too late." Panic surged through me. I yanked the radio from the table, but it slipped from my hands and crashed to the floor. The voices stopped, the static cutting out abruptly. Silence. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The radio sat on the floor, still and lifeless. But as I stared at it, I noticed something strange. The dial had shifted on its own. It was no longer tuned to the stations I had been listening to. It was set to an empty frequency, and the sound of heavy breathing filled the air. I picked up the radio and immediately tossed it out of the Caravan, my heart racing. The breath continued, growing louder and faster. I rushed to lock the doors and hide under the covers, my mind racing. The next morning, I drove away from that campground without looking back. But I'm not sure what happened to the radio. I never saw it again. Now, whenever I hear static, I can still hear those voices, just barely, whispering through the air. My name is Sophie Collins, and I've always enjoyed long drives. There's something calming about the road stretching endlessly ahead. The quiet hum of the engine, and the world slowly passing by. But there was nothing peaceful about that night. I was traveling across the desert in my Caravan, heading to a new destination I had been planning for months. I had been on the road for hours, the heat from the sun now replaced by the cold of the desert night. It was a remote stretch of highway, with nothing for miles but sand dunes and the occasional road sign. As I drove, I saw something strange in the distance headlights. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle on the road, but as I got closer, the lights didn't seem to move. They were stuck in place, like they were hovering in midair. Curious, I slowed down to get a better look. The headlights belonged to a van, but the van wasn't on the road. It was sitting at an odd angle, the wheels buried in the sand, as if it had been abandoned. I stopped my Caravan a safe distance away and rolled down the window. It was quiet, eerily so. No wind, no sound of animals, just complete silence. I called out to see if anyone was around, but there was no answer. Cautiously, I stepped out of the Caravan and approached the van. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. There was a strange smell in the air, like something rotting, but I couldn't quite place it. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to investigate further. I opened the door, and the inside of the van was a complete mess. Clothes were scattered everywhere, and there was a faint, yellowish stain on the floor. But what really caught my eye was the mirror on the dashboard. In the reflection, I saw someone standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The road was empty, just the endless stretch of desert under the night sky. My heart began to race as I backed away from the van. I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me, and not from a distance. It was as if they were right behind me, standing in the shadows, waiting for me to turn around. I quickly ran back to my caravan, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged. I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw it. The van's headlights had shifted. They were now directly aimed at me, and there was no one inside. The van sat there, staring at me with its unblinking lights. I didn't waste another second. I slammed the caravan into gear and sped off down the road, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and I haven't gone back to that stretch of highway since. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still feel the eyes on me, just beyond the rearview mirror. My name is Chris Owens, and I've always been the kind of guy who doesn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends. But that all changed the night I picked up a hitchhiker on a long, lonely stretch of highway. It was late, past midnight, and I was driving my caravan back from a job in a neighboring town. The road was straight and empty, with barely a car passing by. I had been on the road for hours, the hum of the tires against the asphalt lulling me into a trance-like state. I had only one thing on my mind: getting home. As I drove, I saw him, a figure standing by the side of the road, thumb raised, looking for a ride. His clothes were worn, and he looked like he hadn't showered in days. But it wasn't his appearance that bothered me. It was the way he stood there, perfectly still, as if he had been waiting for hours. I hesitated at first, but I figured there was no harm. I had room in the caravan, and I didn't mind offering a stranger a lift. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice crackling through the stillness of the night. The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a dirty cap. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. I unlocked the door, and the man climbed in without saying a word. I tried to start a conversation, but he was strangely quiet, just staring out the window. The longer we drove, the more uneasy I became. The air inside the caravan felt colder, and the silence between us grew heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Where are you headed?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. He didn't respond, but I could feel his eyes on me, as if he were studying me from the corner of his gaze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Minutes turned into hours as we continued down the highway. I couldn't remember passing any exits or landmarks, but I didn't think much of it. I had been driving for so long that I wasn't sure where I was anymore. At some point, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The man was no longer sitting next to me. The seat was empty. I whipped around to look at him, but there was no trace of him anywhere. No door opened, no sound of movement, nothing, just an empty space in the caravan. I slammed on the brakes, nearly swerving off the road. My heart was pounding in my chest as I searched frantically through the caravan, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. He had simply vanished. I pulled over to the side of the road, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't explain what had just happened. My hands were still on the steering wheel, but it felt like the night had shifted. The world outside the caravan had become darker, the air colder. It felt as though I was no longer alone. I didn't stick around to find out. I sped back down the road, desperate to get away from whatever had just occurred. When I finally made it home, I didn't tell anyone. I still don't, but I know one thing for sure. I will never pick up another hitchhiker again, and I can still feel his eyes on me, even now. My name is Harper Woods, and I had always loved the freedom of the open road. My old caravan was more than just a place to sleep, was my sanctuary, the one place I felt truly at peace. It was a cheap RV, but it had a certain charm, a sense of comfort that made it feel like home. I had been traveling for weeks, hopping from one campsite to the next, meeting fellow wanderers and exchanging stories. One evening, I arrived at a secluded campground I'd never seen before. The place was off the grid, surrounded by dense trees, hidden from the world. The only sign that marked it was a rusted metal plaque that read, "Whispering Pines Campground." It seemed like the perfect spot to rest. The campsite was eerily quiet, too quiet for my liking, but I wasn't about to drive another mile, so I set up camp. I pitched my tent, made a fire, and spent the evening relaxing by the flames. As night fell, I noticed something strange. There were no other campers around. No one had arrived after me, even though I'd seen other vehicles earlier in the day. It felt like I had the whole place to myself, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The air was cold, the moon casting an eerie glow on the trees. As I wandered further into the forest, I heard the sound of voices. It wasn't clear at first, but soon it became more distinct, high-pitched, almost childlike, and yet unsettling in its intensity. I walked deeper, following the sound. The laughter grew louder, but I could still see no one, just the dark shadows of the trees. And then, I saw it. A small clearing ahead, where several campfires were burning. Strange, considering I was sure no one else was supposed to be here. I approached cautiously. As I got closer, I could make out the silhouettes of people sitting around the fire. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but I could hear their conversations. Their voices were distant, muffled, like they were coming from someplace far away. Then one of them turned. A tall man, his face obscured by a hood, looked directly at me. His eyes were wide, staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Before I could say anything, the man stood up and motioned for the others to follow. They rose in unison, like a group of marionettes being controlled by some unseen force. The moment they stood, the fire flickered violently and went out, plunging the clearing into complete darkness. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter that had once filled the air was now replaced by silence, and a cold wind began to blow through the trees. I ran back to my caravan, stumbling over the uneven ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. When I arrived, I locked the door and stayed inside, too afraid to venture out again. The next morning, I packed up quickly, ready to leave. As I looked around the campsite, I realized something unsettling. There was no sign of the campers I had seen in the clearing. There were no tracks, no footprints, nothing. It was as if they had never been there. I drove away from Whispering Pines as fast as I could, my hands still shaking. I never went back to that place, and I don't think anyone ever will again. My name is Liam Harper, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over a decade. I've driven through countless stretches of highway, some well-lit, others isolated and desolate, but nothing prepared me for the night I ended up on the road to nowhere. I was driving my Caravan, a makeshift home I'd put together for the long hauls. I had just crossed into a remote part of the country, somewhere deep in the desert. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the landscape. I had been driving for hours, the radio static filling the silence of the open road. When I saw the sign, it was already too late to turn back. The sign read, "Welcome to Red Canyon. Please drive safely." I didn't think much of it at the time. I had been on countless roads before, but this one felt different. The landscape was eerily still, the air thick with an unnatural quiet. As I drove deeper into the canyon, I noticed something strange. There were no other cars, no trucks, no cyclists, nothing. Just me, the endless road, and the darkening sky. I thought I might have missed an exit, but I didn't recognize any of the landmarks around me. The further I drove, the stranger it became. The trees were bent at odd angles, their branches twisted, like skeletal hands. The wind howled, but there was no movement in the air. It was as if everything around me was frozen in time. Then came the headlights. In my rear-view mirror, I saw the glow of another vehicle. It wasn't there before, and I hadn't seen it approach. It was too close for comfort. I checked the side mirrors, but there was nothing there. No road, no other car, just empty space. I didn't panic at first. It could be another trucker, I thought. But as the light grew brighter and the sound of the engine roared closer, something felt wrong. The closer the headlights got, the more I felt the air grow colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on me. Suddenly, the vehicle was right behind me. I could see its outline in the mirror, a massive dark truck with no distinguishing features. I could hear the engine, now, revving in an unnatural rhythm. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to get away from whatever it was. The vehicle matched my speed, keeping right behind me, as though it was deliberately following. I glanced back again, and my stomach dropped. The truck's headlights were no longer just lights. They were burning red, like twin eyes, staring back at me. There was something moving inside the cab, something unnatural, distorted, and out of place. I swerved off the road, hoping to escape, but when I looked back, the truck had disappeared. There was no sign of it anywhere. Just the endless stretch of desert highway and the looming cliffs around me. I pulled off to the side and sat there for what felt like hours, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone on that road. I didn't drive through Red Canyon again. I couldn't, and I don't think I ever will. My name is Ella Ramsey, and I've always loved the freedom of the open road. I was traveling in my little caravan, a cozy old thing that had seen better days, but it was mine, a home on wheels. It was late fall, and the air had that crisp edge to it, perfect for camping. I had driven through narrow mountain roads, passing through several small towns, until I stumbled upon a place I'd never seen before, a forgotten campground nestled between two towering trees. The sign was faded, barely visible, but it said, "Welcome to Cedar Hollow." No other campers were in sight. The silence was suffocating, and something about the place felt wrong, but I didn't want to drive any further. The next town was miles away, and I was exhausted. I parked the caravan and made myself a cup of tea, trying to shake off the unease. As the evening set in, the trees around me seemed to grow darker, casting long shadows over the campsite. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. At around midnight, I heard it. A knock, soft at first, but then louder, a constant, rapping against the side of my caravan. I froze, staring at the wall. I knew no one was supposed to be out here. The campground was abandoned. I cautiously peeked through the curtains, but there was nothing, just darkness. I thought maybe it was just the wind or some animal, but the knock came again, more persistent. Bam, bam, bam. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I turned on the lights, trying to drown out the eerie sound, but it didn't stop. I opened the door slowly, my breath coming out in shaky clouds. The night air was thick and heavy, and the woods seemed alive with strange noises, and that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing by the campfire ring, just beyond the trees. It was tall, its outline blurry like it was made of smoke. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood there, frozen, staring at the thing. It suddenly turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness of the forest. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I locked it. I couldn't sleep after that. I spent the rest of the night watching the trees sway in the wind, waiting for morning. When the sun rose, I quickly packed up and left. I never spoke of what happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. There was something in Cedar Hollow, something that should never have been disturbed, and I'm never going back. My name is Jake Malone, and I've always considered myself a skepticus, especially when it comes to the supernatural. That's why, when I bought my Caravan, an old RV that needed more work than I cared to admit, I figured it would be just another adventure, a way to get away from the noise of city life and into nature. I never expected it would become the site of something I couldn't explain. It was a rainy Friday evening when I found myself parked at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere. The dark clouds had settled in, and the only sound was the steady pitter-patter of raindrops against the roof. The kind of night where you just want to curl up with a book and wait for the storm to pass. But there was something off about the rest stop. It was too quiet, almost like the place had been abandoned for years. I walked outside to stretch my legs, but there was no one around. Just a row of empty RVs parked along the gravel lot. I shrugged it off and went back inside, settling into the worn couch with a cup of coffee. As I looked around the small interior, I noticed something strange. The rearview mirror on the dashboard was reflecting something that wasn't there. I leaned closer, trying to focus on the mirror. I saw the reflection of my RV in it, but then there was something else. A dark figure standing just outside the door, hidden in the shadows. I jerked back in surprise, but when I looked again, nothing was there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was tired from the long drive. I turned away and went back to my book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A tap, soft at first, then louder, coming from the door. My heart raced, and I stood up quickly, grabbing the nearest flashlight. I shone it through the small window, but there was nothing there. The rain continued to pour down, and the lot remained deserted. I turned back to the mirror, and there it was, again, the dark figure. Clearer this time, standing just behind my RV, staring at me. I stumbled backward in terror, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the RV, but when I looked back, the figure had vanished. There was no one there, only the empty rows of RVs parked in the rain-soaked lot. I never figured out what that figure was, but I couldn't stay another minute. I jumped into my RV and left as fast as I could, not stopping until I found a well-lit gas station miles down the road. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing. There's something about the mirrors in that RV, something that shows you things you shouldn't see.